All right, let's go ahead and get started. I know we'll have some more folks trickling in. And I apologize to everyone if my voice sounds a little croaky. I think the conference has finally gotten to me. I woke up with a little bit of a sore throat today, so just bear with me. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tammy Gilden, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's panel discussion on the Jewish fight against genocide. For those of you who don't know us, JCPA is the national umbrella body of the Jewish Community Relations Network, representing 125 local Jewish community relations councils and 16 national agencies, including the 4 denominations of American Judaism. For almost 80 years, JCPA has advocated for civil and human rights here in the United States and around the world. In the Jewish community, we vow never again. But the truth is that never again has already passed us by. Mass atrocities and yes, genocides against ethnic and religious minorities are happening across the globe. In Burma, the Rohingya ethnic minority face renewed danger as the very same military that perpetrated a genocide against them has now complete control over the country after its successful coup. The Chinese Communist Party is systematically torturing, sterilizing, and murdering over 1 million Uyghur in concentration camps. The Yazidis in Iraq are facing renewed threats from extremists, and credible reports of ethnic cleansing is emerging from Ethiopia's Tigray region. In a few moments, we'll have the opportunity to delve deeper into these crises and, most importantly, how we can address them. But before we do so, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. Lawrence is the research director of the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He's published widely on early warning, conflict prevention, and prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, and has previously held roles in the United States government, international NGOs, and the United Nations. Wes serves as the Elie Wiesel Act Implementation co-chair of the Prevention and Protection Working Group, a coalition of NGOs, including JCPA, that's dedicated to improving US policies and civilian capacities to prevent atrocities. JCPA and many of its local affiliates were staunch advocates of the Elie Wiesel Act. And Wes, in his official capacity, works on atrocity prevention and international criminal justice issues, in addition to the Prevention and Protection Working Group. Amanda is a senior advisor with the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Conflict Stabilization and Operations. Across the Bureau's efforts to address fragility, prevent conflict, and advance stabilization, Amanda advises on how to prevent, mitigate, and respond to atrocity risks. And lastly, but certainly not least, Amber, Holocaust educator and human rights associate for JCPA's member agency, the Indianapolis Jewish Community Relations Council. She's also the co-founder and chief program officer for the Crane Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing the root causes of violence. And I should also mention that Amber is the architect of the draft resolution condemning the Uyghur genocide that JCPA and over 70 of its member organizations will be voting on adopting tonight. So thank you all for joining us and joining me on this panel. I'd like to set a more conversational tone. So I think I'm going to start with questions for each of you, starting with Lawrence. As we're thinking about the Jewish framing and history around genocide and atrocity prevention, can you tell us more about why and how the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is tackling this work and where you're focused right now?
Sure. Let me just start by thanking you, Tammy, and JCPA for inviting me for this important discussion. So the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, from its inception, was conceived to be a living memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. And this idea of being a living memorial implies engaging with the world today, not just the world of the past and the history. And in particular, working on contemporary instances or threats of genocide and related crimes. The 1979 President's Commission on the Holocaust, which was the report that then set up the creation of the Holocaust Museum, stated quote, what threatened one people in the past could recur to threaten another people, or indeed all humanity. And then went on to state that only a conscious, concerted attempt to learn from the past errors can prevent recurrence to any racial, religious, ethnic, or national group. And then finally, the kind of most important point that animates our work, a memorial unresponsive to the future would also violate the memory of the past. I should mention that Elie Wiesel was the chair of the President's Commission. So the commission recommended creating a committee on conscience as part of the museum to alert the national conscience, to influence policymakers, and stimulate worldwide action to prevent and halt genocide and related crimes against humanity. The Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide, where I work, is the part of the museum that now carries out that work day to day, along with the Committee on Conscience, a group of external experts. And so how do we do that? We engage in a combination of research, engaging with policymakers in the US government and elsewhere, of working with affected communities and publicizing the ongoing atrocities, bringing their stories to light, and also helping them advance justice. So currently we're focusing what we call our bearing witness work on publicizing atrocities, some that you've already mentioned, against the Uyghurs in Western China, against the Rohingya in Burma or Myanmar, and against a wide range of civilian populations in Syria who've been suffering for many years atrocities at the hands of the Assad regime. I should know we're also working through our early warning project to understand what are the early warning signs of genocide and mass atrocities, and where around the world can we identify those as being present before the atrocities have begun, so we can encourage preventive action. We're also studying past cases to try and learn what kinds of policy actions are most likely to be effective at preventing genocide and atrocities. And as I noted, last but not least, trying to work with affected communities to help them advance justice and accountability for past crimes. So this is kind of the approach that we're taking to play our part in trying to make this pledge of never again a more practical reality.
So much, Lawrence. Excuse me. Wes, now I'd like to turn to you, building off of the themes that Lawrence has kind of set for us. As a leader in the Prevention and Protection Working Group, or PPWG, as we like to call it, can you tell us more about how organizations are working in coalition to engage in national and international advocacy around prevention and mitigation? And especially how PPWG is engaging with Congress and the administration?
Sure. So it's important to emphasize that non-governmental organizations have always had a significant role in promoting prevention and mitigation of atrocity events. Often these organizations are the ones on the ground, made up of or working with local civil society actors, who are the ones who see the warning signs that, like the ones Lawrence just mentioned, that the Early Warning Project studies and quantifies, that raise concerns about possible future mass atrocity events. And I want to emphasize that we've come a long way in understanding the types of activities that governments or those in power engage in when they are seeking to other groups. It is not, there's this misconception often that, oh, all of a sudden an atrocity happened. That's not the case. There is a process that goes on of acclimatizing a population to the idea that it is okay for these things to happen. There are very few individuals, if any, where they just wake up one day and say, yes, let's destroy an entire population. That seems like a good thing to do. It is a process. And because it is a process, there are indicators along the way. Not all of these indicators are the same in every state or in every culture. Some of them are very context and culture specific. So something that may be a huge red flag and very concerning to us in one country may not even be of significant issue in another because of the local circumstances, because of the particular trends and history that exist in different places. So we work really hard to identify that. And that's why it's so important that PPWG, for instance, which is comprised of more than 200 different civil society organizations that engage on this, can bring these perspectives to bear, because there's no way that any of our representative groups, even those who only focus on very specific regions of the world, can identify all the potential indicating and warning factors. You need a large collection, a hive mind, if you will, of individuals pooling their resources, pooling their knowledge, and sometimes being able to identify, hey, if this particular form of othering, which is a broad term that we use to reference the attempt to make a people feel like they are not part of the cohesive group. If that type of othering is happening, let us know, warn us about it, tell us what's going on. And so in that context, organizations within civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations are often the ones who can raise that early warning indicator and say, this is problematic, please be watching, please be paying attention to this. And now, given the tools that Elie Wiesel and the Global Fragility Act have given us, can also be mobilizing the US government to actually take steps. Like, it's one thing to say, we want to mitigate or respond to ongoing mass atrocity events. Important thing, there are significant actions that can be taken to save lives and to prevent things from getting worse. However, the goal is prevention. The goal is to actually stop us from getting to that point. And so being able to draw these things to the attention of state actors is really critical. And so in that context, PPWG is very privileged to work with the US government. The Elie Wiesel Act requires that US government engage with civil society actors. Given the breadth of scope of civil society actors that PPWG represents, it has taken on that kind of interaction role and does so regularly. Amanda and I are trading emails and in contact all the time. We also don't hesitate to criticize. PPWG is not afraid to say, we think you're messing up here. We think you're not doing things well. We think you're potentially missing signs. One of the things I think we're most proud of is we've been able to bring specific country reports from places that may not be high on the radar, because prevention means that things have not actually gotten to the point where they usually rise to the level of, oh no, everything's gone terrible and we need to interact. And that's both the challenge and the benefit. Like, it gives us more time to act, but the US government has a lot going on. And as we say repeatedly, the State Department was not designed to care about atrocity prevention as a priority. It has taken that on, and we're thrilled with that. And the Elie Wiesel Act has codified that to a certain extent, but it wasn't designed that way, which means that prevention has to constantly be emphasized. And so PPWG works to bring in those local civil society voices, prepare country reports, and put them in front of the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. And I think I'll leave it there, other than to say, we also report back to Congress on this as well. Like, the civil society actors are going to Congress and saying, hey, you passed the Elie Wiesel Act. Here's what's happening. Here's what the State Department, the Defense Department, the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force is doing. You should pay attention to this. This is important. And for example, last year we had a briefing for the Senate Human Rights Caucus and the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission specifically on that, to draw their attention to it. So we keep working with that. But it is very much a collaborative effort in partnership with our US government colleagues.
So before we turn to Amanda, who I think is going to be a great follow-up to that, representing the government here, I'd like to take a step back, and Wes, if you could just give us a little bit more of the landscape in terms of what we're talking about with the Elie Wiesel Act, Global Fragility Act. You've mentioned several different task forces. Let's take a step back and walk folks through kind of the different mechanisms and bodies that are at play here.
Yeah, so it's a good point, Tammy, and it's worth flagging that as I mentioned, the US government was not set up to care about atrocity prevention. That was not in anyone's design ideas when they were creating this. It has been recognized going back into the Bush administration, and even to a certain extent in the Clinton administration before that, that this was an important thing, that we should be paying attention to these kinds of things, primarily from a national security lens, because these problems metastasized into bigger issues that then dealt with potential military intervention or humanitarian crises that cross borders, destabilized regions, and that kind of thing. During the Obama administration, we saw the issuance of PSD-10, which is Presidential Study Directive 10, and eventually an executive order that focused specifically on emphasizing atrocity prevention. And it created what was called the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was a interagency group, a whole of government approach to try and encourage the US government to address these issues from a prevention perspective. That, however, was an entirely executive order driven action, which means that there is no permanence to it. There is no requirement statutorily that it had to continue. So for several years, PPWG and many other organizations worked very hard to try and see the Elie Wiesel Act get passed. It went through years of different drafts. It was submitted to committee multiple times. Was sometimes didn't even get out of committee, sometimes got to the House and never got a vote, etc. But it was passed in 2018 and signed in early 2019. The Elie Wiesel Act requires that the US government undertake a series of different kinds of actions to pursue prevention specifically. Some of that involved kind of a support for whatever the Atrocity Prevention Board was. It has become the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. That is now the name for the whole of government approach to trying to deal with atrocities in advance. It also required certain reporting things. It required training for foreign service officers. It required the publishing of a list, which we're still working on getting to have happen, and other things like that, that put this on policymakers and diplomat actors' roster of things that they must pay attention to. It can no longer be something that would be nice if it were added on. It has to be there. I mentioned the Global Fragility Act. That's a related but kind of separate element. The Global Fragility Act says some of these problems about atrocities things are related to instability in certain regions, but it also affects things like education, access to food, access to human rights, access to healthcare, all of which should be areas where the US is helping promote development, because that will make for more stability, and more stability makes for more security overall in these regions. So we see those working together.
Thank you so much, Wes. That was excellent. And I think that perfectly tees up. Amanda, you have worked in both DoD, Department of Defense, and the State Department. So can you tell us more or share more about how the US government is approaching genocide and atrocity prevention and mitigation? And to really talk about why prevention is so important and how that fits within our policy.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tammy. I also want to say thank you to you and to JCPA for inviting a U.S. government representative. And I'm happy to be here with Wes and Lawrence. We've worked together for many years on atrocity prevention, and excited to hear the insights from Amber about kind of more local community efforts, especially here in the U.S. So as Wes mentioned, the Elie Wiesel Act really was critical because it codified an executive order that at any time was vulnerable to being rescinded. And so the purpose is to really institutionalize atrocity prevention as in the United States national interest. And that's what the act says. So when, internal to the government, for those of us that are working on more functional issues, we do have to do similar advocacy work with our regional bureaus. And so we use a lot of the, very strong arguments that, thought leaders like Wes and Lawrence have produced, and their early warning lists, to kind of make our case internally. But when we would discuss kind of how does atrocity prevention relate to, US foreign policy and national security, I mean, we talk about national security interests in the sense that mass atrocities can cause widespread displacement. They can have regional and international instability implications. They can affect international trade. And they also create very deep grievances that can drive interruption or continuance of conflict, as well as violent extremism. And so all of these can and have impacted U.S. national interests. So even, right now we have kind of record-breaking displacement numbers, unprecedented number of refugees and IDPs. And many of these were a result of, fully man-made humanitarian and human rights crises, like Syria, Burma, and South Sudan. And then beyond just the displacement, security, economic implications, the United States also has a moral imperative here to prevent atrocities, because we, in our foreign policy, are pushing promotion of human rights and democratic principles, and human rights really are the bedrock here of what we're trying to do. So human rights and protection of civilians, they're foundational to U.S. foreign policy and the goals that we have overseas. And so you mentioned the atrocities that are perpetrated by ISIS, both genocide and crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing in Burma, and even in Xinjiang right now in China, that the People's Republic of China has and continues to commit genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and other, ethnic and religious minority groups. And then one other point that I wanted to make on kind of the importance of this issue is we have an additional challenge now, which is the global pandemic. And what that's doing is it's turning attention and resources away, like kind of towards crisis response and emergency health. And it's leaving space for, and we've seen this already, for violent extremists and, authoritarian leaning governments to, commit human rights violations and impunity. With impunity, there's less access to information. It's inhibiting the work of NGOs on the ground too, that are usually kind of our eyes and ears on the ground. And I think we're also seeing certain cases where underlying atrocity risks that were already there, pre-existing, are being exacerbated. So, scapegoating members of ethnic and religious minority groups and blaming them for the pandemic. We've also seen a huge increase in violence against women and girls as well. So for the United States, I think Wes really kind of gave a really good overview. We're committed, even the Biden-Harris administration is kind of really taking a rights-based approach and putting human rights kind of at the center of our foreign policy. So we're, committed to advancing the Elie Wiesel Act. And as Wes mentioned, the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, it's run by the White House. My Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, serves as secretariat, but we also have representatives, from other State Department bureaus, USAID, DOD, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, Department of Justice. That includes members of FBI and our intelligence community. So we focus on early warning, and we work really closely with, the folks in the NSC that are covering specific countries, the regional directorates, to produce, atrocity risk assessments based on, a lot of tools that civil society and Lawrence and Wes have contributed to and put together, and integrating what civil society is telling us of what's happening on the ground, and then producing, atrocity risk response plans. And that involves, for State Department, working with our like-minded partners, engaging with them, and then also in multilateral forums, so like the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council. So finally, you asked kind of why prevention matters. And I think we all know that we have to improve our responses to early warning signals. And as Wes said, the indicators are pretty well established and pretty well researched. And it's not that we don't have the information. It's, there are uncertainties, there are hesitancies, there's a lack of, political will, but, there have been studies about prevention and how much it saves us. So, the money that we spend on improving, human rights institutions or working on justice and accountability, are way, way smaller than the amount that it costs when there is a full-blown humanitarian crisis, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars for political, financial bailout, development, military costs. And so that's really kind of another reason why prevention is really important. And part of prevention also includes accountability, just to make sure that, you're deterring kind of future perpetrators, you're advancing reconciliation. And, the Holocaust Museum and others have shown that a history of atrocities is one of the strongest predictors. So I'll close here for now, but thank you
so much, Amanda. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice here. So Amber, I want to turn to you, and I think, you're sort of the linchpin of this conversation, because as we're learning about all of these crises and how important prevention is, what really matters is what we can do when we go back to our communities. So I really want to address this feeling that issues can seem too big for a local community to tackle or to have an impact on. But we know that that's absolutely not the case. So I'd love it if you can share more about how Indianapolis decided to take on these issues and what you all are doing.
Sure. Thank you, Tammy. And thank you to JCPA for asking me to be here today. So the Indianapolis JCRC has been involved in the mass atrocity prevention field off and on, really starting around the grassroots mobilization efforts during the genocide in Darfur. So during the early 2000s, Indy JCRC worked with Indiana legislators to get a resolution passed that promoted the divestment from Sudan. And then starting in 2017, at the height of the mass exodus of Rohingya from Rakhine State in Myanmar and the genocidal violence being perpetrated against them, Indy JCRC was the first JCRC to join the Jewish Rohingya Justice Network, which is a consortium of Jewish organizations advocating for the rights of Rohingya people, including JCPA is kind of the overarching organization with that. So I kind of say those things because it was through this work that we noted that there was kind of a real appetite and need for this type of work on a continual basis at the JCRC level. So of course, the issue of mass atrocities is a deeply personal one to the Jewish community. And so it just kind of made sense to have someone who could address these issues on behalf of the local Jewish community. And somebody in particular who has had experience in the mass atrocity prevention field. Indianapolis is actually somewhat uniquely situated to engage in this type of work, mainly because we have very large diaspora communities from post-conflict societies. So we have a large community that is from Burma, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Rwanda, and all communities, whether they realize it or not, have refugees, have asylees, have people who have fled violence that they can really work to build bridges and build relationships with these communities. So while we've always had relationships with these communities, we are now able to engage with them in a way that we hadn't before. Now we are really able to work more closely with these communities and provide a platform for the voices of these communities whose stories have yet to be told. We have also been in the process of developing relationships with national and international organizations that are specifically focused on certain atrocities, but also others that are a little bit more global. We've started to work more closely on atrocities occurring in China against the Uyghur and other Turkic ethnic minorities, as well as the horrific violence we're seeing in Myanmar since the February 1st coup by the Burmese military, the Tatmadaw. We've been able to really start to do this work because of the relationship building we have done with national Jewish organizations such as JCPA and other JCRCs around the country. We've also been engaging in education around these issues. So over the past 3 weeks, we have held a panel discussion on atrocities in Myanmar and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have our last panel discussion tomorrow night on the Uyghur genocide with Mustafa Aksu from Uyghur Human Rights Project and Uyghur human rights advocate Rehana Saat. So our goal is really to start to serve as a model for JCRCs around the country. Every JCRC, every Jewish community has the ability to have somebody that is able to provide advocacy for human rights, provide advocacy for mass atrocity prevention. So I guess you could just say if every JCRC had someone dedicated to mass atrocity issues on staff, and we were all able to collaborate on advocacy campaigns and legislative outreach, just imagine the impact we could have. If you think about all the JCRCs that are out there and the mobilization of the Jewish community, just imagine the sort of grassroots effort that we could really build towards preventing violence.
Thank you so much, Amber. And we're gonna build on that theme in just a moment. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I think I'm going to try and combine sort of 2 tracks of questions that I had wanted to pose to you all. And that's, what are some of the challenges but also opportunities looking ahead? And I think maybe if we can address that together, you know, what the most important piece of this panel is, which is the what you can do. If we can kind of combine those and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities in how we can get involved in the coming months, weeks, and years. So let's go back and start at the top with you, Lawrence.
Sure, great. Well, I think unfortunately I see lots and lots of challenges, but that shouldn't deter us from engaging. I applaud Amber and for the work that she's done there in Indianapolis. I guess I'd highlight 2 challenges quickly. One, I think, is more at an individual level, this concept that you referred to already, Tammy, that mass atrocities, genocide seems too big, and it's just easy for people to become sort of numb to the enormity of the problem, to the distance from our daily lives, in the sense that even if we were as individuals around the country or around the world to try to do something, it would just be a drop in the ocean and not really amount to anything worthwhile. So I think it's a challenge to overcome that for sure, given that we're talking about phenomena that are defined by their enormity, by their massiveness. Secondly, I think of challenges within government. So challenges to bureaucratic and political incentives, which unfortunately often don't support prevention, even though the logic that Amanda outlined is very clear and compelling. But you know, any warning is going to come with some uncertainty about the possibility of future atrocities or future violence, and the idea of taking preventive action requires somebody to take some risks now, to incur some costs now, even if they're modest, to try to head off an uncertain possible worse future. And unfortunately, for risk-averse bureaucracies, for political leaders who may be looking at sort of parochial interests, it doesn't often add up to engaging in those preventive actions. Plus, it can be hard, even if you do, to then point to the success and get some credit. it can be hard to distinguish what is successful prevention from what was an overblown warning in the first place. Whereas actually responding to an ongoing humanitarian emergency, providing food and support to refugee populations, that's actually much more tangible, and sometimes political leaders can get credit for that, whereas they might not get credit in the kind of crude sense from preventing those circumstances in the first place. So I think there are a lot of challenges, but I come back to just one of the mantras of the Holocaust Museum is what you do matters. And I think we should all try to really take this seriously and think of our ability to work individually and together on these big problems. Just because the problems are big doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle them. So I think firstly is to just get informed and really deliberately not turn away, even when that's our instinct, to sort of sit with that discomfort. And then to share with friends and family. You know, in this day and age, we're all sort of our own publishing houses on social media. And so our reach through our networks is actually greater than it was years ago. Learn about relief efforts for affected communities. Consider providing donations or support that can actually provide, you know, immediate benefits. And then I think the last point, which is maybe the most ambitious, but I go back to one of the recommendations from a project that the museum co-sponsored back in 2008 called the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which tried to gather a group of former officials and eminent people to make recommendations on how the U.S. government could do better in this area.
I'm gonna have to ask you to just wrap it up so we have time for the rest of our panelists to address the question. I apologize. What you're saying is so interesting, and we could go on.
No worries. Yeah, I think the last point is just organize, get together with others, engage with your representatives, and make sure that they know that you care about these issues.
And I think that's actually a perfect place. I do want to pick up on something that Amber said, which is, you know, JCRCs are spaces where communities come together, and you all are a part of this. One of the things that I really wanted to show here today, through your local community relations council, which is in turn part of the larger JCPA network, which is in turn part of this larger NGO body through the PPWG, we do have this sort of force multiplying effect. And we have seen, I think, a great example of this is the Jewish Rohingya Justice Network that I helped found a few years ago with our partners at AJWS, building on our partnership during the Save Darfur campaign. And when we come together as a Jewish voice, you know, as a Jewish people to Congress, they sit up and listen because we have that authority and that history and experience that really allows us to speak with that authority. So I really want to pick up on that as I turn to you, Wes, to talk about really how organizations through PPWG have that impact.
Sure, and I'll just emphasize that in that context, local organizations matter. They matter significantly. The Elie Wiesel Act was a legislative approach to atrocity prevention. It was a unique way of addressing what had traditionally been the executive branch's prerogative in, you know, foreign policy, external relations, foreign relations, et cetera. And to put it bluntly, your legislators care about what their constituents tell them to care about. And so we have, working with the PPWG, we have developed relationships with legislators on both sides of the aisle who care about this because their local communities have gone to them and said, this is important to us. Maybe because, like Amber said, there's refugee communities from that specific region of their part of the world. Maybe because there's just a dedicated peace movement group in that area. Maybe because they just say, this is supposed to be part of the values of the United States and we think we should be living up to it. As Amanda identified, you know, human rights are supposed to be, you know, a fundamental element of US foreign policy. We don't always live up to that. And you as individuals, as communities, and as local actors can influence your legislators. We can tell a difference when a legislator has been hearing from their community about this, because they come to us and they say, hey, what is this? Why are my people talking to me about this? Why do they know more about this than I do? Someone come and brief me about this. That's great, because then we get action from them. And sometimes that's people who take on a championship role and they're, pushing forward legislation. Sometimes that's just people who may be in the background. Appropriations, Amanda mentioned this, is critical. And some people who serve on the Appropriations Committee, that's like the tedious and boring and spreadsheet-driven kind of thing. I cannot tell you how much it matters to be able to have funds that the US government can spend on preventative measures. So really critical there. And I'd like to give a shout out to the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which actually hosts PPWG and puts a lot of effort behind, trying to organize that kind of interaction. It's really critical. Local city resolutions are incredibly valuable. They are actually a statement of local interest and policy on this. Yes, they may affect US foreign policy in any way. They're not going to change the ship. But if it shows up more and more, and we're seeing this in things like climate change as well, where local city ordinances and councils have started saying this matters to us and it's making an impact at the national level, you can do that. The last thing I'll mention, just in terms of time, and we can certainly circle back to this if we have time, is the US is not immune to this. We talked about how there is a climatization process that happens here, and we have seen simply during the pandemic hate actions and speech against Asian Americans, a recognition of the reality of the systemic racial bias that exists against large numbers of minority communities, specifically the African American community. So in terms of what you can do, get involved in your local community, root out the signs where othering is happening, root out the signs where people are being persecuted or discriminated against because of things that they cannot change about themselves, because of who they are, and don't let that happen in your local communities. If you're not actively fighting to prevent this, you are going along with it. And
right.
That is.
And I think this really connects back to a panel that we had yesterday on disinformation. And it's something we didn't really address here, but social media platforms like Facebook, for example, have been a major driver in conflict and in genocide. And so when we think about fighting anti-Semitism locally, when we think about fighting hate locally, it all connects back to this larger effort. So Amanda, I want to give time to you to kind of talk about where the US government really sees its future endeavors, its efforts, where they're going to be putting their focus, and how they're planning to work with civil society.
Thanks, Tammy. Yeah, definitely second. All the challenges that Lawrence mentioned were the same ones that I was going to. And then, Wes, I think that these are, really important. I think it's something that also the Biden-Harris administration has kind of made clear. I mean, there's been a slew of executive orders, if anyone's been able to keep up, but one of them actually mandates that representatives from domestic councils are actually included in conversations that are happening in the National Security Council. And I think this is where you can kind of see that there's a link here between, and Secretary Blinken said this as well, that foreign policy is domestic policy. And I know, particularly last year, and Wes will remember this, we had a lot of conversations about, atrocity risks in the US and, State Department's in kind of a difficult position in that sense, because we don't have a domestic mandate. But I will say for, additional kind of recommendations besides getting involved with the PPWG, no comment on the engaging with your legislators, since I'm in the executive branch and not the legislative branch. But I do think at the community level, there's an importance to recognize and discuss, hate speech and early warning signs. But then also, I think that advocating for proper education is really important. And we had a really interesting discussion with a few of our like-minded countries last year, talking about Burma and just seeing how much the national curricula does not reflect accurately the history or, you know, what the various groups, you know, their values or identities, et cetera. And so I think that, you know, kind of looking at our curricula, even here in the United States, and advocating for that with our school boards and elected officials, that, you know, we're doing historical memory. And, you know, one of the issues, the Holocaust is much more well known, and it actually kind of backfires a little bit for us within the US government, because when we raise early warning situations, they will immediately say, this is not a Holocaust situation. You know, even if they don't, they're kind of looking at that as that is the threshold, as opposed to saying this is the worst possible, you know what I mean, of taking no action. And so that can be a little bit difficult. So as far as, I'll just wrap up here with our kind of priorities going forward. So the State Department is supporting the White House and kind of their mandatory during administration changes, kind of our little sprints and policy reviews of all the countries. But that also includes kind of a targeted review by the White House of the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, and kind of the structure and the processes, and how it is going to, in particular, how we're going to weave in atrocity prevention across the Global Fragility Act. And Wes mentioned that, you know, the Elie Wiesel Act does not have a related congressional earmark, so there's no funding attached to it. But the Global Fragility Act does, and it's $230 million a year. And so we really want to make sure that we're, as part of, you know, addressing the underlying drivers of fragility and conflict, which is what the GFA is supposed to do, recognizing that, you know, atrocity risks and violence against civilians is also an underlying driver. And so kind of meaningfully, thoughtfully integrating those across is going to be kind of one of our big focuses. And we have a congressional report also that you all see in July. You can find the last two reports online. And so hoping that we meet some of civil society's recommendations in there, but then you can kind of see what we're going to lay out, also some other additional recommendations that we have for ourselves. And so that'll be public and released to Congress in July.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I really love that you brought in Holocaust education, because that's something that's very important to our community. And, you know, a few years ago, JCPA and its network actually passed a resolution affirming the importance of Holocaust education, and as part of Holocaust education, educating around other atrocities and genocides, and as part of a larger strategy for combating hate and atrocities. And I think actually your point about, you know, when new atrocities are brought up, you know, the reaction is often, well, this isn't a Holocaust. And I'll say that I've seen that in our national advocacy. And one of the most powerful ways to push back against that is to have a united Jewish community that is organizing around these crises and saying, no, we do think this is a genocide, or no, this is something that could turn into a mass atrocity, or ethnic cleansing, or, you know, even genocide. And I think we've seen really amazing strides made in Congress around the Rohingya, which we've taken on in the Jewish community in a very active way, and now moving into taking on the genocide of the Uyghur and hopefully more. So with that kind of in mind, I want to turn to you, Amber, to talk about some of the, and then I actually want to I do want to move to questions, although I don't see any in the chat. So if you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A under the workshop tab, and I will be happy to pose it to our moderators. But while you all are putting in your questions, I do want to turn to Amber and just ask if you can share some best practices or advice you have to other local communities that are looking to engage in this work.
Sure. So, I mean, Lawrence and Wes and Amanda really kind of hit on some of those already, but I say personally, I believe that the work of mass atrocity prevention really starts at the community level through the relationship building process. It is incredibly important to build bridges with communities, from diaspora communities, refugee communities, other faith communities, and then moving from there to forming relationships with other organizations around the country. Of course, working with policymakers and those in federal agencies is a necessity, but it's ultimately the community that is the driving force for change. And that's a very grassroots approach, but it works. And it takes everyone at every level of society to be involved, to actually prevent atrocities, to motivate the political will for our legislators to stand up and say, you know, this goes against our belief system as Americans. It goes against our humanity to allow this to continue to happen. So it's my advice would be to continue building those relationships. Educate yourself, educate your community about the issues, because an educated community is going to be more likely to get involved in advocacy. Form a strong support network that can really become a collective voice that advocates on behalf of human rights. Sum that up quickly. Everyone already said kind of really a lot of the challenges and opportunities that I would have said, but I guess there's my little summary.
No, that's great. And I actually see we have 2 questions on kind of the same theme in the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I think I said chat earlier. I'll be looking at both, so that's fine. So we have a question on kind of what the panel's view is of responding to retroactive declarations of genocide, such as in the case of the Armenian genocide. And I would be remiss not to note that JCPA and its member agencies back in 2015 actually adopted policy stating that we believe that it's a genocide. So that's something that JCPA and our organized Jewish members have actually taken a position on for a number of years. I can actually put that in the chat, but I'd like to just pose that to all of you. So whoever wants to tackle that first, please feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll quick say that working on this issue from PPWG's perspective, not on the Armenian genocide, but working on prevention, we're happy that the Armenian genocide has been recognized as such. It's critical that we actually acknowledge our history and acknowledge when these things have happened and deny governments the ability to use historical cover of, you noticed even in the Turkish foreign minister's response, he called it the events of 1915. They're very careful about the language they use. No government should be given that kind of cover. What's frustrating from TPWG's perspective is this has happened. The Uyghur Declaration happened. The ongoing elements of different places have been noted. And yet the treatment of the Rohingya, for which we actually have far more actual evidence to actually prove, including the IIMM from the UN, the ongoing case in front of the International Court of Justice of the Gambia v. Myanmar and the evidence there, huge amounts of content. This clearly should rise to that level. Let's be clear, the State Department does not issue judicial findings. This is a diplomatic, political statement about we believe a genocide has occurred. And we still haven't had that in the case of the Rohingya. So one of the things, and Amanda knows this because she and I have talked about it extensively, is trying to actually regularize the process of making a determination, not just on genocide, but on atrocities writ large, war crimes, crimes against humanity. It is important that we call these things out. There are lots and lots of political reasons why you wouldn't want to do so for foreign policy. That doesn't change the moral imperative and, quite frankly, the preventative nature of doing so.
Thank you so much. Does anyone want to add anything in? I think that was a pretty strong overview. I do want to note, I feel bad for everyone who has to follow up Wes. I do want to say, on the genocide determination issue, this is something that JCPA has been working on for a long time. We've been trying to get a genocide determination for the Rohingya for 4 years now. And got really close a few years ago, and then kind of had that yanked back at the last minute. And so we were really happy. I mean, happy is a strange word to use, but we were really grateful that we got a genocide determination for the Uyghur. But right now we're pushing, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken on a genocide determination for the Rohingya, and actually just sent a letter to him a couple weeks ago on that. And so there are opportunities, and we'll try to disseminate more of those for local communities to engage in our national advocacy. So we do have another question from the chat. So could it make a difference to avoid conflict-associated products, for example, cotton and solar panels from China that are produced by Uyghurs and others who are persecuted? So this is a very interesting and complex question that I'll pose to the panelists, whoever wants to take that one first.
I can start just because it's related to, the efforts that the State Department pushed really hard last year was releasing the Xinjiang, the Business Advisory Council. And so in addition to, the targeted sanctions that were placed for members of the PRC that were implicated in the genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs, was also looking at the supply chain of, where cotton was coming from, originally from Xinjiang, and doing that with our like-minded partners to ensure that everybody had a list of, companies that may have been, complicit in that supply chain. So I do think that those, I can't say, statistically, I think it's the same thing with kind of the targeted sanctions too. I think that we have good stories to tell in some cases, but it might be a little bit too early to tell kind of, what impact it's having on people's behavior. But I think that economic levers in particular have proven to be, pretty strong sticks as opposed to, some of the other kind of lighter tools that we have in our toolbox.
And I'm going to pick up on a particular piece of legislation that sort of gets at this, and I'll pose this to Amber and Wes if you want to jump in. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We are trying to push for a hearing. I don't think it's happened yet. I think we were hoping for one, last week, and it keeps getting pushed back. But that bill would essentially put a ban on the import of these goods from this region, which we know, almost well over like 95% of the goods produced in that region are produced with forced labor. So rather than putting the onus on consumers, I think there's widespread agreement in the Uyghur advocacy community that what we really need is an importation ban. So we already have a partial ban. We want to expand that, and I'll leave it to my colleagues Amber and Wes if you want to jump in and talk more about this bill. Amber, sure. I'm going to call on you first.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, it does become a little sticky, I guess you could say, when you're asking about, do we refuse to buy certain products, and what is the actual sort of on the ground realization of refusing to buy specific products. But this particular bill, I agree that it, having an import ban would be more effective than kind of a grassroots boycotting, mobilization, particularly because China's economy is so large and the supply chain network is so intricate. We know that, as you mentioned, that a vast majority of the products that are coming out of Western China have been tainted by forced labor, which also means that they've been tainted by genocide, because the funds that the People's Republic of China, the PRC, receives in turn goes back towards building more of these concentration camps, goes towards building more of these forced labor factories. And so it becomes a cycle. And so if we are able to say, as a united front that we are not going to allow these products to come into our country, because we do not want to continue to perpetuate the cycle of violence and genocide. That's the right move. As you mentioned, we were hoping to have it go into markup, and it has not as of yet. It does have pretty good bipartisan support, although nowhere near as much as it did when it was introduced in the last session. I think that will change once it goes through markup and once we're able to have a hearing upon it. But I would highly encourage those that are within the JCRC community, within the local advocacy community, to really reach out to your elected officials. First to look at, are your officials already co-sponsored? Are your senators already co-sponsors of this legislation? If they are not, find out why, and then address those issues. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation that needs to get passed. And as we've mentioned before, it's really those at the local level that are going to drive and push the ball forward.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, was that my own echo back at me? I think it was. Okay, so we're past the 3:30 mark, and I don't see any more questions in the chat or in the Q&A, but I will say that we'll be ramping up our advocacy on this bill and others. We'll be doing more outreach around getting a genocide determination, and so I hope you'll all stay tuned in with us so that we can bring these opportunities to you, and providing opportunities for education for you and your communities through these amazing virtual platforms. So I think I'm going to close that out. If you want to get in touch with any of our panelists, just reach out to me and I will try to connect you. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me. Thank you everyone so much for taking time out of your day to learn about this issue. And thank you to all of my panelists. You all did a fantastic job.